everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. At Darien Library, I like to think that all of our programs are very special, but tonight's in particular is very, very special because we have the author here of our One Book, One Community Choice 97 Orchard. I'd briefly like to mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by our annual Friends of the Library campaign. So thank you for your continued support to make programs like these and our collections available to the community. Every year, a committee here at the library works to choose an exceptional title for our One Book, One Community series. This year's pick, 97 Orchard, is no different. And I can remember vividly back in November when my colleague Pat Tone came and said, "We should do 97 Orchard, it's about food." If you've read the book, however, you know that it is about so much more than that. Our country has always been known as the Great Melting Pot, much of this owing to the influx of immigrants who arrived to New York City around the turn of the 19th century. 97 Orchard explores this history, with particular attention paid to New York's Lower East Side. In the book, our author describes the living conditions of German, Irish, Italians, and Eastern European Jews, told through the lens of their residents at 97 Orchard Street. Tonight's guest is the director of the Tenement Museum Culinary Center and the founder and director of Kids Cook, a multi-ethnic cooking program for children. Her writing on food has appeared in numerous publications, and she is the co-author of Foie Gras, A Passion. She is visiting us tonight from Brooklyn Heights, Brooklyn. So if you'd please join me in welcoming to Darien Library our One Book, One Community author, Miss Jane Ziegelman.
I have to bring the mic down. That's before every talk I have to. Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to Darien. This is one of the most beautiful libraries I've ever seen. It's really lovely. So I'm very happy to be here. I'd like to open the talk tonight by reading you a piece of a really remarkable document. It's a letter from 1884. It was written by an Irish immigrant. Her name is Kathy. We don't know her last name. And she's writing home to her mom, to her mother in Ireland, in Ballylarkin, Ireland. And at the time this letter was written, Kathy, who we know is quite a young woman, we might even say a teenager, at the time she was writing, she was alone in New York. She had emigrated alone, which was entirely typical of the Irish migration. Unlike other groups which came over as families, the Irish really came over one by one, and usually just the children. It was, in essence, a migration of teenagers. Kathy is working as a domestic servant, which again was a typical occupation for the young Irish woman in New York. You'll see that although in many ways working as a domestic servant had its advantages, you got free room and free board, which allowed you to save money, and that allowed you to send money back home to Ireland, it also was a tremendously isolating experience. And you'll see in Kathy's letter some of the, I guess, the more emotional challenges of what it meant to be an immigrant like Kathy in New York at this time. And this is her letter. My dear Mama, what on earth is the matter with you all that none of you would think of writing to me? The fact is, I'm heartsick fretting. I cannot sleep the night, and if I choose to sleep, I wake up with the most frightful dreams. To think it's now going and gone into the 3rd month since you wrote to me, I feel as if I'm dead to the world. Well, this is just how the letter begins. But it goes on in a very similar vein, and in fact, the drama builds until the final line, which is, I trust you are well, and that my frightful dreams won't be realized. Kathy. And then, just in case there's any ambiguity in the letter, her postscript is, with love to one and all, and for God's sake, write soon, your lonely daughter, Kathy. While there's no explicit reference in this letter to food, Kathy's letter very poignantly and dramatically describes the emotional context in which food was eaten. Along with the challenges of just plain survival, of putting food on the table and a roof over one's head, immigrants faced a whole battery of psychological challenges, including loneliness and anxiety and shame and isolation. These were all just absolutely part and parcel of the immigrant experience on an everyday basis. When you add to this the cultural strangeness of being in a place like New York, you begin to understand why food mattered so much. It was one very important source of continuity in this otherwise alien environment. Now, for me, the real satisfaction in writing 97 Orchard was not the writing, but the research. A real archaeological kind of adventure of digging through these old sources and finding pertinent material. And the sources were many and varied, and things came up in the most interesting places. Of course, the kind of information I was most intent on finding was information about food. But from the very beginning, I really thought of the food as a way to get to the people, to the immigrants, to their stories, and to the world of the tenements, which really, in a way, became my focus, was the tenement itself, which in many ways fostered a kind of culture that was unique to urban America at a particular historic moment, and which I don't think we'll ever see again. Sources like Kathy's letter, these are accounts produced by the immigrants themselves, provided one kind of perspective on both immigrants and their food. Another perspective came from outsiders. These were native-born Americans who came to the tenements to observe and document the immigrants on their home turf. The picture that emerges from these reports is 100% subjective. Americans interpreted immigrant behavior through their own cultural prism. And that same prism, as I discovered, very strongly colored American attitudes toward the foreigner's food. It was one facet of immigrant life that native-born citizens scrutinized very closely and with tremendous interest. As it became clear to me, behind all of the food biases that you see in Native American or American-born writing on immigrants were much larger concerns about immigration and about its consequences, about its effects on America and the way America was changing. In short, in the relationship between immigrants and America, food became a kind of cultural battleground. And I'm going to look at some of the places where these battles were fought. But first, I'd like to give you a sense of the unique physical world of the tenement, which, as I suggested earlier, really was like less of a backdrop and more of a character in the immigrant story. The apartments at 97 Orchard, and of course this is the tenement, the one tenement I know the most about, were a total of 320 square feet. Those 320 square feet were divided into 3 rooms, loosely defined. There was one front room called the parlor. This was usually the only room with windows. There were 2 windows. There was a back room. It was an entirely windowless room. And there was in the middle a kitchen, which had a window looking onto an air shaft. So there was only one room with windows facing the street or facing the courtyard. The kitchen was really the geographic and emotional center of the apartment. The largest sort of object in the apartment was in the kitchen, and that was the cast iron stove, which was the tenement apartment's only source of heat. There was no kind of furnace or fireplace. It was just the stove. Because the building lacked indoor plumbing, one of your chief responsibilities as a tenement dweller, and particularly as a woman in the tenement, was hauling water up and down the tenement stairs. There was a pump in the backyard. So everything, any water that you used in that kitchen, whether it was for cooking or washing your body or washing your clothes or doing housework, was hauled up the stairs from the pump in the backyard. And this was extremely arduous work and was particularly difficult in winter when you were carrying these buckets of icy water and they would slosh over the edge of the pail onto your long skirts into this in an unheated stairwell. Now, hot weather brought its own challenges. In the typical tenement apartment, because only that one room in 3 had windows, the indoor temperature absolutely skyrocketed on a hot summer day in New York. To beat the heat, at night, fire escapes were transformed into sleeping porches, and the rooftops in tenements became these communal open-air bedrooms. During the day, to facilitate the flow of air, front doors were left open, allowing the inside of the apartment and the life inside of the apartment to spill out into what we might consider the public space of the hallway. And you'll also notice that in tenement apartments from this era, there are all kinds of windows and openings that you wouldn't see in a modern apartment building. There were windows between the tenement and apartment in the hallway, both to facilitate the flow of air and to allow light to come from the apartment into the hallway, because there was no lighting in the stairwell itself. All of the light came from the apartment, sort of seeping in, trickling in from one of the, came from the apartment trickling into the stairwell. In other words, tenement apartments, unlike what we think of as a modern apartment, were not sealed off from the outside world. Tenements were porous structures. They were riddled with all kinds of openings of windows and doorways between inside and outside, which in effect blurred the line between public and private, between family and non-family. All of these boundaries that we think of today as hard and fast simply did not exist in the world of the tenements. So, for example, if it were cold or if it were raining, tenement kids would play in the hallways, using the stairwell as their jungle gym. Men smoked their cigars in the stairwells, while women used the stairwells as an extension of their kitchens. When the apartment was too hot or too crowded, the homemaker would pull a chair into the hallway, and she would sit on her chair and she would peel her potatoes, or pluck her chicken, or scale her fish. This is also where she socialized. This is where she would meet with other women in the building for a nice cup of tea and for some good building gossip. The great majority of immigrants who came to the Lower East Side, many from the countryside, had never encountered anything even closely resembling a tenement. Yet the immigrants found ways to adapt the tenements to their own needs. So, for example, in spring, Italian homemakers, and these were women who grew up in a rural context, in rural settings, planted old wooden soapboxes with tomatoes and peppers and basil and oregano, and they created window gardens. At harvest time, they would return from the markets with great bushels of vegetables and would go about preserving them just the way they had back in the old country. So they might jar the tomatoes, turn them into sauce, jar them, and put them up on the shelves for winter use. The peppers, they might slice in half, and they would string them, thread them onto long strings, and sort of hang them, suspend them from the fire escapes, sort of like Christmas lights, and allow the peppers to dry in the sun. Excuse me one second. These were all absolutely rural practices and rural traditions transplanted to New York. Against all expectation and what we might think of as common sense, East Side immigrants also raised animals. Up until 1860, the East Side was home to thousands of pigs. These were creatures that were set loose by their Irish owners to forage in the streets. Their prime feeding ground were the curbs, particularly in front of vegetable stores and butcher stores, where there was this wonderful buffet of rotting debris for them to feast on. Now, to the uptown visitor, this was all highly offensive. But in fact, these pigs were performing a really valuable community service. They were the city's hardest working and most enthusiastic street cleaners. Where the Irish kept pigs, the Italians kept goats. Another tradition carried over from the European countryside and just transplanted lock, stock, and barrel to the heart of urban America. Italian goats were often kept in the apartments and treated as family pets. If a homemaker was busy and the baby was crying, she would put the baby on the floor and have it play with the goat. And I've read many accounts of just this. When little Italian boys came home from school, they would hitch the goat to soapbox wagons, which they had crafted themselves, and run the goats in circles in the tenement yards where their mothers were hanging laundry. Unfortunately, the fun came to an end on feast days like Easter, when the family pet wound up on the family dinner table. Both of these animals, the goats and the pigs, were raised primarily for the family's own consumption. But the Lower East Side was also home to full-blown commercial poultry farms. This was one of the great shocks to me in my research. To give you a picture of what these farms were like, I'm just going to read a brief excerpt from an 1870 report that was put together by the newly formed Board of Health in New York. And here's the excerpt. In New York, the Board of Health has carried on a struggle for some years with occasional breathing spells for both combatants against the practice of keeping poultry for sale in the manner practiced by Polish and Russian Jews, on the plea that their religion requires them to eat only those fowl that have been killed in their sight by a killer authorized under their ritual. They fill the places where they live with chickens, turkeys, ducks, and geese. These poor fowl are huddled together in coops or crowded into pens, generally in the basement of the house, and make an incessant noise. The smell, too, from 50 to 100 geese is indescribable. And these people live in an adjoining room and wonder that any person finds their practice obnoxious. Well, the first thing I'd like to point out about this report is that our health inspector seems to have more of a sympathetic relationship with the birds than he does to the people. But this is really typical of this moment. From the immigrant's perspective, yes, the tenement poultry farm was not ideal. However, these poultry farms provided Jewish immigrants with a steady and reliably kosher source of protein, and if it meant sharing space with the birds, it was worth it. Through the 19th century, native-born New Yorkers shopped for food from city-owned public markets or from small kind of specialty shops in the neighborhood. In the 1860s, immigrants introduced New York to the pushcart market. This was a retail system born in the shtetls of Eastern Europe and transplanted to the streets of the Lower East Side. The pushcarts offered immigrant shoppers the foods they wanted, many of which you could not find elsewhere, at rock-bottom prices. And for women who lived on the Lower East Side, many of whom fed their families on 20 cents a day, this was an average ceiling for a daily food budget, rock-bottom prices were very important. Also important, the pushcarts allowed East Side homemakers to buy food in the quantities they wanted, and these quantities were often really minuscule. Remember that tenement kitchens had no source of cold storage, and they had very little storage space of any kind. So the tenement homemaker essentially shopped meal by meal, once in the morning for breakfast, and then again in the afternoon for supper. This was absolutely typical of the homemaker's day. This way she could buy just enough to feed the kids for that night without anything going to waste, without spoiling overnight. Since women on the Lower East Side literally lived on top of the pushcart markets, it was possible for a woman to lean out the window, call to her vendor, tell them what she wanted, and then send her kid down with a nickel to pick up the merchandise. So here you see another interesting example of this blurring between inside and outside. The pushcart market is really functioning as an extension of the homemaker's pantry. Uptown New Yorkers who ventured down to the pushcarts were shocked to find immigrant women buying one stalk of celery, or half a turnip, or a single cup of rice. But the one purchase that really hit home for me was over at the egg stand. This is where immigrant homemakers could save half a penny by buying damaged eggs, where the shells were already shattered. To make sure that the interior of the egg was still edible, the woman would crack the egg into a mug, something that she brought with her in her shopping basket. She would give the egg a sniff, look it over. If it passed muster, the egg was hers. But that half penny mattered. And that, for me, that scenario, buying that egg, dramatized that most clearly. The New York newspapers published a steady stream of articles condemning the pushcart markets for its poor sanitary conditions and the suspect quality of its food. The public outcry reached a crescendo at the beginning of the 20th century, which resulted in a pushcart census. The Pushcart Census was held in 1906. It was called by the mayor of New York. He convened a special commission, and this group conducted a street-by-street survey that went cart by cart, documenting every pushcart on the Lower East Side, interviewing every vendor, inspecting the merchandise, and so on. To the city's surprise, the study found that the food sold from the pushcarts was generally really pretty fresh, and it was wholesome. And in fact, it was of better quality than the same merchandise that you could find in stores. The turnover was incredible. But native-born Americans objected to immigrant food on other grounds as well. By the standards of the day, immigrant food was excessively spicy, or as the term of the day was, highly seasoned. It had a surplus of garlic and onions. Immigrants ate too many smoked meats, and they were too generous with condiments. But the one food Americans objected to most was pickles. Early 20th century nutritionists declared pickles too salty, too garlicky, too peppery, and too sour. All in all, they were just too flavorful. Now, without question, the epicenter of the immigrant pickle problem was the Jewish Ghetto. A study done by an American dietitian named Bertha Wood in the 1920s described Jewish shops on the Lower East Side that sold nothing but pickles. To the American, this was mind-blowing. However, before long, immigrant groups living in close proximity to the Jews discovered the pickle, adopted it, and before long, the problem was really epidemic. According to the medical experts, the real victims of the immigrant pickle habit were children. Health workers were appalled to learn that tenement school kids spent their lunch money on pickles instead of more appropriate foods like a soft white roll and a glass of milk. The taste of the standard Jewish pickle was so aggressive that Americans wondered how anyone could eat this food by choice, and particularly a child with their delicate and innocent palates. More than a food, the pickle was a kind of drug for tenement children who were still too young for whiskey. And this is really quite literally what the health experts believe. There were if you look at nutritional textbooks from the period, you'll see there's a section called stimulants. And in these chapters, in the stimulant chapter, you will find coffee, tea, alcohol, heroin, cocaine, and pickles. As it turns out, the experts were not entirely wrong. Pickles were not exactly the gateway drug that they had imagined, but tenement kids did have this really special affection for them. The reason was simple. For a single penny, a pickle delivered this wallop of taste, of flavor, that was this very important counterpoint to all of the potatoes and the bread and the noodles and starch that made up the bulk of your daily diet. And if you knew how to eat a pickle, you could make these last. There's a wonderful scene in the book, in the novel A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, which, if you read it, you know is not about Jews. It's about an Irish family in Brooklyn, but an Irish family who does happen to live near a Jewish community. And the heroine of the book is a young, really plucky, great character, a girl named Francie, who goes to the Jewish market one morning to buy a pickle, and who spends the rest of the day nursing this pickle, sucking on it and nibbling it, really sort of taking care of it, and it lasts her until dinner time. For an immigrant kid like Francie, this was the popsicle that never melted. Americans felt it was their duty to tear the immigrant away from their pickles and all their other pungent foods, and to teach them the virtues of plain American cooking. Of course, it was for the immigrants' own good, but it was also for the larger good. In the first decades of the 20th century, as immigrant rates continued to climb, Americans decided that culinary reform was the key to effective assimilation. As a result, culinary instruction became a standard feature of both the settlement houses and the public schools. Here in the public schools and in classrooms across urban America, immigrant daughters learned how to poach eggs, how to boil oatmeal, how to cook cream sauce, and other similarly bland American foods. The hope here was that educators could reach the parents by way of their children, using these girls sort of as Trojan horses to smuggle these foods into the tenements. But of course, the real payoff came 10 or 15 years down the line, when these same kids had their own families and would raise their kids on chicken salad and tomato soup. Looking beyond the realm of food, I'd like to close with a few final thoughts on the tenements and how they figured in immigrant history. The Lower East Side and neighborhoods like the Lower East Side, and many cities had an equivalent Lower East Side, served as a kind of training ground for new immigrants. It was here in the tenements, surrounded by their fellow countrymen in this environment of relative safety, that immigrants learned how to become Americans. They learned to speak English. They learned new domestic skills and new forms of work. They also learned how to look and act like Americans. So this is where immigrant men put away their boots and bought a proper pair of lace-up shoes. It's where women folded up their kerchiefs and bought a proper American hat. On Sundays, East Side immigrants took the elevated railroad to Coney Island, just like any other New Yorker, and on the 4th of July, they hung flags from their fire escapes and they lit bonfires and they danced in the streets. They were celebrating the birthday of their country, and they felt that this was their country and this was a day, an important day of celebration. When it came to mealtime, however, these same immigrants went to extraordinary lengths to preserve their native foods and food traditions. On the most concrete level, native foods looked and smelled and tasted the way food was supposed to taste. These are the foods that the immigrant had grown up on, and the foods which they recognized as viable. This is what people are supposed to eat. On a more abstract level, native foods provided the immigrant with a bridge to the past, to the relatives, and to the hometowns that they would never see again. So it was this wonderful and important thread to a world that was otherwise severed. I'd like to suggest that in the last 100+ years, American eating habits have really come full circle. The foreign foods that caused us so much distress are now mainstays of our dinner table. We're not afraid of pickles. We're not suspicious of garlic or of flavor in general. Immigrants gave us their foods, but they also gave us their taste buds. And if we're lucky, they also left us with some small fraction of their ingenuity, their stamina, and their spunk. Thank you. I'd be really happy to answer any questions that people have had who have read the book, or questions just raised by the talk. Yes?
You mentioned the letter when you started.
Yes.
So she said that all did relatives come and bring the letter back, or how did the letter?
The honest truth is I'm not sure how that letter was preserved. I know that in the Tenement Museum archives, so I did quite a bit of research in the museum archives, there is this cache of letters which was collected by a professor of Irish history, and somehow he got their hands on them. There are letters survive, and I'm not sure how it happens, but it happened.
Maybe letters came back with relatives who then immigrated subsequently, do you think?
It could have been that, or it could have been that this professor had been doing research in Ireland and he collected letters from the Irish relatives in Ireland. But one way or the other, they made it. Yes?
These times after the Civil War must have been dire times for these immigrants. What were the social safety nets during those days?
The social safety nets. Well, they were not the same social safety nets that we would know today. I know one thing that comes to mind is that there were dispensaries, in other words, health clinics for poor people that were scattered through the city and that were concentrated in working neighborhoods. So there was availability of medicine. I mean, that's sort of the one official kind of civic contribution to social welfare, but I think the real safety net were the neighbors on either side of you. There was a tremendous degree of inter-family cooperation, and the idea was that there was reciprocity, you knew that when you helped the guy down the hallway because he was out of work or he had broken his hand and couldn't bring in a salary, and your wife brought over a pot of sauerkraut and sausages, when you were down, you would get the same in return. And that kind of exchange was constantly going on between immigrant families. I also know that when private charities became more active on the Lower East Side, so these were charities set up by the settlement houses, for example, there was tremendous resentment by the immigrants to the condescending manner in which they were treated by sort of the upper crust New Yorkers. It's a really good question. Yes?
What was the average length of stay for families at these tenements, and where did they typically move on to?
Well, first of all, people moved very, very frequently. Something you should know about tenements is that the first month's rent was free. This was tremendous incentive to keep moving. And because you had very few possessions, moving was not the kind of ordeal that we think of it as today. You would hire somebody with a push cart, so you would get the guy who sold onions during the day, you would give him an extra 20 cents at night, and he would move your feather quilt and your 2 pairs of shoes and your kitchen pot. And that's sort of about all you had. So people traditionally moved at least once every year. If you stayed for 4 years or more in one place, that was a long residency. People did move around the neighborhood, but the real step up was Brooklyn. Brooklyn or the Bronx. If you could get to Brooklyn or the Bronx, it means that you might have a tree on your street. It's where you might see the patch of sky might be a little bit wider. So the idea was to get out into the boroughs. Yes?
You had a lot of recipes for the book. Did you make any of them?
I've made almost all of them. There's one that I really didn't understand. It's an eggplant recipe, which calls for cooking the eggplant in a vase. And I'm pretty sure it's not what we think of as a vase, but that just threw me, and I couldn't go through with it. I've made just about everything else.
What's your favorite? Or don't you have it?
Well, I'm a lot like those tenement kids. I really do have a thing for pickles. Anything that involves sauerkraut, I'm very much in favor of. And I've tried making. I've made my own pickles and I've made my own sauerkraut. That's probably my favorite. Yes.
Has there ever been a study done of all the fathers who went to work and never came back?
Well, there is not that I know of, but there's a lot written about them. This might be mentioned in the book. In the Lower East Side newspaper, the Jewish Daily Forwards, there was a page called the Gallery of Missing Husbands. And it would run photographs of these runaway husbands so that by chance, if you caught one on the street, you could turn him in. I mean, it was very much in the Jewish press. But I don't know of any academic study. But it was a terrible thing, my God. I don't know how they did that.
I thought the part about being in Ellis Island and the Orthodox Jews not eating anything.
Yes.
And it was very interesting. And I think here we saw a movie, The Dream World, about did have an Italian family going to Ellis Island. And it was very interesting. And but it was very nice that eventually they had people to help these people.
Well, Ellis Island was really interesting in that way because in some respects the experience of being there was just horribly dehumanizing. People were really kind of ushered through as cattle. They would poke your eyes open, squeeze your glands. It was really it wasn't a nice place to be. You could also be detained on Ellis Island, where you were literally kept in a kind of cage. On the other hand, there were these moments of tremendous humanity, and one of them is in the food, was this effort to provide immigrants with food that would be familiar to them and acceptable to them. So it's just part of the kind of paradoxical nature of Ellis Island, which I agree is a very interesting place. Yes?
What was the role of oysters at the time? Because I know in New York City, that was the freshest, cheapest, everything incredible. But then the Jewish people, so how did oysters play a role in the tenements?
Well, the oyster it's a unique food in American culinary history because it was equally beloved by rich and poor, and it was eaten by rich and poor in exactly the same way. So both ate oysters on the half shell, both made oyster stews and oyster pies. It kind of filled a hole that no other food in our history has ever filled. People did eat oysters on the Lower East Side. If you were a Jew, you might have eaten oysters too, if you were more toward the Reformed end of the spectrum. And there was a term, a term of condescension for a devout Jew to describe his less pious brothers and sisters. He would call them oyster eaters, and that was sort of a sign that they had gone over, that they had fallen.
New York City harbors themselves, were filled with oysters. This was a very...
Well, toward the end of the 19th century, the oyster population was already pretty well decimated in our harbors. Long Island was still pretty rich, but a lot of the oysters were coming in now from Chesapeake. So that New York oysters had been farmed for so long, so intensively, that it was the effects were already there, were very visible, sort of by maybe the 1880s, 1890s. Yes.
I don't have a question, but I have a comment.
Sure.
And I have to say that I couldn't get enough of your book.
That's so nice.
I didn't know. I kept reading. It brought back so many memories.
Really?
That I didn't know if the next chapter or the next page, what memory is going to come back to me. It was really, really terrific.
What memories did you?
Many, but especially making that gefilte fish.
Okay.
That I used to help my mother. It took, I don't know how many hours chopping that big wooden bowl.
Yeah.
And then, she very carefully removed the skin so she could
Amazing.
stop it. And then I always wondered, why is it that my father always gets the head? And now I know you're getting the answer. Tradition.
That's right. The head goes to the head of the family.
Yes, the head goes to the head of the family.
Well, of all the recipes that I made from the book, that gefilte fish was the most challenging.
Oh, I'm sure.
It involves taking a whole fish, flaying it, taking out the flesh, deboning it, but leaving the skin intact so that you just have this kind of envelope of floppy skin. Then doing what you do to the flesh, chopping it and mixing it with various ingredients, and then filling the fish back up, sewing it. It's like a surgery. Sewing it back up, laying it in the pot very carefully on a bed of sliced onions so it's gently nestled in the vegetables, and simmering it very slowly and carefully, taking it out, and then you slice it into rounds. So each round is this perfect circle disc of fish with this skin exterior, the silvery exterior. It increased my respect for the immigrant cook, maybe 1,000%.
And my mother made sure always to line the bottom of the pot with sliced carrots, because that could stick to the bottom.
That's exactly right, and that would be tragic because if you lifted the fish, the skin would tear. Terrible.
And she used to stuff the chicken necks.
Another great stuffed food. Well, you know, stuffing food is the great way to stretch protein. So the Jews stuffed absolutely everything in sight. And Italians also were great stuffers. They stuffed different items. That's right. But, you know, your stuffed squids and your stuffed zucchinis and peppers and eggplants. And meanwhile, the Jews were stuffing spleens and other parts of animals. But that's a strategy of poverty.
Thank you. This is amazing.
Great.
Thank you.
Is that okay?
Yes. Well, first of all, I love your book. Thank you so much. It really increased my respect too for the immigrant cook, and we have very easy today. But I was interested in your kids cook, your multi-ethnic cooking program that you are the founder of.
Right.
Can you explain it a little bit?
Yeah, I could say that my background is in anthropology. So I've always been, I'm very interested in cultural literacy. And I'm also very interested in food. About 14 years ago, I had a kid. And now I became really interested in kids. So I put all of these interests together and I decided to start this cooking program. I ran it out of my apartment in Brooklyn Heights that would introduce children to geography and to world cultures using food as a kind of point of departure. And it's been going now since then. I do programs in libraries and schools. We actually did a pasta making class upstairs today with some kids from Darien. It was very fun and interesting. There was sort of a tragic ending to the class, however, because we couldn't get the water to a full boil and we couldn't cook our pasta. Oh well, but that was the idea of Kids Cook. So it was to use food as a point of departure to talk about bigger things like culture. And that's really what I wanted to do with this book as well. Food is a launch pad to talk about these other stories and ideas and history. Yes?
I also loved your book, and what I want to do now is visit the Tenement Museum.
Yes.
Can you tell us just a little bit about what that experience is like? I've heard you have to get tickets.
How you do it? Yeah, you can't just drop in. It's not like a normal museum. You have to book ahead. So you go to the Tenement website, and I haven't done it, but you will see that you can book ahead for different tours, and there are 3 or 4 different tours that focus on different families and different themes. They all are very powerful and very effective. You're led through the museum in a small group, maybe of 10, 12 people, and you're led through by an educator, somebody who's very well trained in the history of the museum, who will tell you the stories of the families who lived in whatever apartments you're visiting. And I know that there are some people here who have been to the Tenement Museum. It's this it's a really unique experience. You somehow, being in that space, seeing these artifacts and hearing these stories add up, have a kind of cumulative effect which is greater than the sum of its parts. And you leave there kind of in a limp ragdoll kind of state. So I don't know if that sounds good, but that's kind of what it's like. Yes?
What age appropriate would that be stored?
What age appropriate? Yeah, well, of course it depends on the maturity of the kid, but I would say about 10 is the right time to start going. And there is one tour that's particularly good for kids, where where you visit the Confino apartment. It's an apartment once occupied by Sephardic Jews, where a actor plays a character, a girl that was in the family, and she interacts with the children, and you can interact with her and talk to her as if she were in her home environment, and you're just coming, as a visitor. So it's really engaging. Yes?
When the people got off the boat in New York, coming from Ireland, whatever country,
yeah.
How did they find their way, though, to the tenement area? Was there some?
There was a well-beaten path from Ellis Island or from Castle Garden to the tenements. There, first of all, you probably had a relative that was already on the Lower East Side. Your relative would come and meet you at Ellis Island or Castle Garden and just bring you straight back to the tenement. But you knew this was something, you know, immigrants came over in chains. So you probably had somebody here, or you had information from somebody here, and this was absolutely, you didn't have much choice. This was almost where you had to go. I know, I'm not exactly, but it was absolutely routine to go. There were boarding houses that lined the docks. You would spend the first night potentially in a boarding house, and the boarding house would probably rip you off. And from the boarding house, you would find your way to the Lower East Side. Yes?
Why was the first month rent free, and who were the landlords of the tenants?
I'm not 100% sure why it was a gimmick to keep the apartments rented, and the question of who were the landlords is a really interesting question, and the range is fantastic. There were Astors were big tenement landlords on the Lower East Side, but there were also immigrants who bought their own buildings or developed their own buildings and lived in the buildings that they rented out. So there was a tremendous range of ownership. There was also a pretty good range of the quality of the accommodations, and some tenements were truly dreadful. 97 Orchard was quite civilized. It was not. There were some buildings that were broken up into such small cubicles that you really had to live stacked up on one another, where the plumbing and the sanitation were just abysmal, where there were continuous cholera outbreaks. One advantage that 97 Orchard had over other tenements is that it happens to sit on a kind of rise, on a natural rise in the landscape, so it wasn't subject to the kind of flooding that other parts of the Lower East Side were subject to, and those flooded neighborhoods were often kind of beds of typhoid and other communicable diseases that bred in the collected water. Yeah. Yeah.
Some of the apartments larger than this 3-room?
No, they were essentially, yes, tiny little bits. It was a cookie cutter. They were all essentially the same, but certain renovations had to be made to the buildings. For instance, toilets were installed, and when the toilets were installed, little bits of the apartment were eaten away. So you might be in one of the apartments where a foot or two was shaved off to allow for a toilet, but otherwise they were quite similar.
My grandparents grew up had a house apartment in Yorkville, and it was a railroad flat, but it had 5 rooms.
That's a palace, an absolute palace. Yeah. So they were very lucky. That's a great setup. Even today, that would be great. Yes.
When I visited your museum, I was almost surprised that there were 2 rooms or so for each family. I mean, were the rents a little more? Because when you think of all the immigrants and how, as you're saying, crowded everything else,
right?
Were the rents in your particular building historically a little more expensive, or did they sort of limit, so that 5?
No, they were quite average. I mean, I looked at the rents, and I think sort of toward the middle, I saw there was a $6 period, a $10 period. They maxed out at about $12, and that was in the 1930s, early 1930s. But what you have to remember is that the apartments were also housed boarders. And if there was a family of 5, maybe 3 kids would sleep in the kitchen, and then a boarder would sleep on 2 chairs that were put facing each other, and then there were parents in the back room, and maybe relatives who had just come over were taking up the parlor room. So it might look spacious, but that apartment could hold up to 12 people easily. And people also lived and slept and ate in shifts. So there were people who, if they worked at night, for instance, bakers, that was a night profession. If you were a baker, you would get the apartment during the day, and vice versa. So the apartment, every inch of space was maximized to the nth degree, and that's something that just fascinated me about the tenements, is how well space was used. Yeah.
You haven't mentioned this yet.
Oh,
these immigrants thought of their accommodations as opposed to the accommodations they left in Europe.
For many of them, it was a tremendous step up. Particularly when the building went up in the 1860s, this was a pretty classy address. And if you were coming from a small town in Germany and you came to this tenement, a brick structure with a kind of ornate cornice, and, well, there wasn't running water. There was a running pump in the backyard. The water was put in 1905. So it wasn't deluxe, but this was quite a respectable place to live. At least the stove was indoors, and you had, that was considered a modern appliance, particularly if you were coming from Ireland, where you probably cooked over a hearth fire in the middle of your cottage. To have a stove with an attached chimney was really the high life. That was quite good.
In Europe, with one room and an earthen floor.
That's right. But, you know, more important than the earthen floor is the fact that there were no Cossacks coming after you. That was the real luxury.
We have time for one more question, if anyone has.
The last question.
I put pressure on all of you now.
Okay.
I didn't expect to be here, but Klein came to the U.S. about 60 years ago. I've known her 10 years, and she pulls out of the bag all the stuff because she had been to the German butcher today. I guess there's a German butcher up in Westport.
Maybe.
So it struck me, and then when I was here, after you were speaking, I said, what an opportunity. Were you always into food, or did this just overtake you and there you see the world through that lens?
Well, I can tell you that for my 6th birthday, my aunt gave me the Winnie the Pooh cookbook, and I think it all started with that. I still have that cookbook, and I loved it. I just fell in love. So I'm going to go with the first option. I just have always loved food. I love being around it. I love eating it. I love smelling it. I love feeding people. Oh, that's the best. You know, making something that somebody likes, that's a really great feeling. So I have a real affection for food. And then I became, you know, an adult and tried to channel it into something interesting. So this is where it went.
You still